It is often very helpful when studying religious traditions to think about the context in which these traditions originated. We did that with Hinduism by looking at the fusion between the Indus Valley civilization and the new ideas coming from the group that we might refer to as the Indo-Europeans. We did it with Buddhism by looking at the Ganges spiritual tradition that was emerging around the time of our Buddha and of which our Buddha was a part. We did it with Christianity by looking at some of the Jewish beliefs around the time of Jesus, especially concerning the Messiah. And here with Islam, we want to get a good handle on the 7th century pre-Islamic Arab world, because that will give us the context in which Muhammad will emerge in order to begin the religion of Islam. This is a really helpful way of thinking about the beginnings of Islam, because not only will we see some of the key features of pre-Islamic Arabia, and therefore the key features of the context in which Muhammad finds himself, but by studying those key features, we can also very quickly see just how radical Muhammad's message was, because Muhammad will directly challenge each of these very central features of pre-Islamic Arabia with some of his most foundational teachings. So here we get to learn about the features of pre-Islamic Arabia, learn about some of the most basic teachings presented by the Prophet Muhammad, and be able to see how radical those teachings were in directly contradicting and challenging some of those key features. So in some ways, I'm following the way that John Kelsey, a contemporary scholar of Islam, discusses the origins of the Islamic tradition. So the first key feature of pre-Islamic Arabia is polytheism. Obviously, we've seen the word monotheism when studying Christianity. Polytheism is the belief in many gods and goddesses, many deities. And while there were certainly small Jewish and Christian groups within the Arab-speaking world in the 7th century, even in and around the city of Mecca, the vast majority of Arab-speaking individuals were polytheists. That is, they believed in many gods and goddesses. Now, most of them did believe in an all-powerful creator God, and that God is simply referred to in Arabic as Allah. That is simply the Arabic word for God as the creator, the all-powerful divine being. It's not a specific name necessarily for a God. It is the word for God. So for example, if you are Christian and you are speaking Arabic, Allah is the word you would use when in English you use the word God. And the same could be true of other monotheistic traditions. So many believed in this Allah, this all-powerful creator God. But then they also believed in these lesser deities, including daughters of Allah. So Allah actually had offspring in a sense. And there were other deities that might be specifically connected to certain tribes or villages, others that might be believed in by all Arab-speaking individuals. In some ways, this has some similarity to what we saw with Hinduism, where you had what are called pan-Indian deities that are acknowledged by all Hindus, perhaps, but then you had specific deities for particular locations or villages or religious groups, etc. So you had many different deities, right, that were believed in and worshipped by the Arabs at this time in history. There were also important places to worship these deities, and none was more important than the Kaaba. The Kaaba is a religious site that in the 7th century, in pre-Islamic Arabia, was perhaps the most important location to worship the many deities of the Arab world. You would come to the Kaaba, which is basically a stone structure, almost a square structure in the city of Mecca, and you would be able to worship all of the different deities that were believed in by the Arab world. Inside of the Kaaba, at this time in history, were images of the many deities. If there was a deity that people believed in pre-Islamic Arabia, that deity was probably represented by an image, a drawing, a little figurette inside of the Kaaba. We even believed that there were pictures of Jesus and Mary inside the Kaaba. In other words, Anytime there was someone who might be viewed as some sort of divine being, they would be represented by the Kaaba. Then there would be smaller little shrines around the Kaaba so that people could come and make offerings to the specific deities of their choice. They could perhaps perform sacrifices to the deities of their choice. Usually you are worshiping some of those lesser deities in a sense as intermediaries between you and Allah, the all-powerful creator God. The idea was that maybe you didn't directly approach Allah, but you approached Allah through his daughters, through other deities that were important to the Arabs at this time. So polytheism was a key feature of pre-Islamic Arabia. Obviously, for those of you who know anything at all about Islam, it is going to be monotheistic. Islam will, in a sense, have a connection to both Judaism and Christianity, and it will follow both traditions in monotheism, a belief in one God, Allah alone. So that is Muhammad's challenge to the first key feature of pre-Islamic Arabia. His most fundamental teaching is that there is only one God, that all of those lesser deities were simply not real. And Muhammad was living in and around Mecca, and when he started preaching the message of Islam, he directly challenged the polytheism of his culture at that time in history, really showing how radical his message was. And it shows why it was so easy to anger some of the powerful people in and around Mecca who depended on the polytheistic culture for their power, for money, etc. Eventually, and we will see this when we get further in history, Muhammad will be able to come back and take over the city of Mecca. And when he does so, he will actually go to the Kaaba and remove all of those images from inside the Kaaba, destroying them because clearly he sees them as representing idols, as false deities. And instead of destroying the Kaaba, what Muhammad says, and he believes this is revealed to him from God through the angel Gabriel, is that the Kaaba was originally built by Abraham and Ishmael, right? Names with which many of you might be familiar, even if you didn't know a lot about Islam going into these videos. You might be more familiar, if you're living in the West, with Judaism or Christianity. And these are very familiar names. Abraham, a very central figure in both Judaism and Christianity. And while Isaac might be the more important son for biblical Judaism and Christianity, Ishmael takes on a much larger role in the study of Islam, in the tradition of Islam. So Muhammad teaches that Abraham and Ishmael actually built the Kaaba at the order of God, and they built it to be a place to worship the one true God. So the idea is that it had just been corrupted over the centuries, and Muhammad is rededicating the Kaaba as a place to worship the one true God, which was its original purpose when it was built by Abraham and Ishmael. The belief is that one of the stones that is even used by Abraham and Ishmael to build the Kaaba actually takes us all the way back to creation itself and to Adam and Eve and the garden. So this is a very important site to this day for Muslims, right? Perhaps the most important site. But it was transformed by the Prophet when he challenged the polytheism that the Kaaba represented by removing those images and rededicating the Kaaba to a place to worship the one true God, Allah, the only God, who has no sons or daughters or any other deities on his level or even below his level. He alone is divine. And the Kaaba is now the central place for religious worship for Muslims. So that's the first key feature of pre-Islamic Arabia, polytheism. And we've seen how Muhammad directly challenges it, also by looking at the Kaaba and how it factored into this key feature and Muhammad's challenge to it. The second key feature is the denial of an afterlife. The denial of an afterlife. Pre-Islamic Arabs did not believe in any kind of afterlife existence, any kind of continued conscious existence after life. The only way, they said, that you could live on was by leaving behind a legacy. You didn't actually live on by going to a heaven or a hell or anything like that, or being reincarnated, but you could live on in a sense by leaving behind a legacy. In other words, by being remembered by people who would tell stories about you. And that was really the ultimate goal for the life of a pre-Islamic Arab man. And we'll see that it's really limited to men in just a second, but that was the real goal. That's what it meant to live well. You lived well if you would be remembered so that you could leave behind a legacy, because that was the only way in which you could, in a sense, live on. Right? So then the question, of course, becomes, well, how do I need to live so that I will be remembered? Right? What kind of virtues are important to this society so that if I live my life in accordance with those virtues, stories will be told about me? And we have really three central virtues in pre-Islamic Arabia: strength, power, and manliness. The usual translation of that Arabic term: strength, power, and manliness, which obviously shows us that we are in a very patriarchal society, a male-dominated society in 7th century Arabia. So the idea is that that is what it meant to live well. You would live a good life if you lived a life according to those virtues of strength, power, and manliness. And hopefully you could leave behind a legacy so that you would be remembered. In a sense, we could call that the moral code of the day, or the social code of pre-Islamic Arabia. Now, when Muhammad comes into the picture and starts preaching the message of Islam, one of his most fundamental teachings is that there is an afterlife, clearly challenging this second key feature of pre-Islamic Arabia. There is an afterlife, and just as important with that, there is a divine judgment to determine the afterlife. That is, where I go after I live my life on this earth will be determined by God's judgment, the judgment of Allah. And then, of course, the question becomes, what is God looking for when he will be judging me about my afterlife existence? And he is obviously looking for faith. That is very important. But in terms of the way we put our faith into practice, Muhammad tells us that the virtues that are important for God and for Islam are not the virtues of strength, power, and manliness. Instead, they are the virtues of love and service and mercy. So in Muhammad's challenge to this second key feature of pre-Islamic Arabia, he's not only challenging the denial of an afterlife, he's challenging the moral code that went along with the denial of an afterlife. He is saying there is an afterlife, it will be determined by God's judgment, and that the way to live so that we can pass God's judgment is by having faith and putting that faith into practice through a life of love, service, and mercy, directly challenging the moral or social code that existed in pre-Islamic Arabia. The third key feature of pre-Islamic Arabia is what I've called here tribalism, again, following the work of John Kelsey. Tribalism is not just the existence of many tribes in the Arab world at this time. It is really meant to convey the constant battling between the tribes of the Arab world at the time of Muhammad. Right? That's what tribalism really is referring to, the battling, the fighting between the many tribes. There was so much division among the tribes of the Arab world at this time in history. And one of Muhammad's most fundamental teachings is that Islam is not just for his tribe. Islam is meant for all, and therefore it is something that can unite the tribes of Arabia and eventually all of humanity. So he is directly challenging the tribalism of pre-Islamic Arabia by presenting Islam as something that transcends those boundaries and can unite the many tribes of the Arab world, and eventually through the Arab people can unite all human beings. So this is very helpful when thinking about the basics of Islam. We get to see the central features of the society in which Muhammad found himself in the 7th century. Polytheism, the denial of an afterlife and the moral code that went along with that, and tribalism. And then we get to see some of the most foundational teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, monotheism and what that meant in terms of the Kaaba, the affirmation of an afterlife and divine judgment, and what that meant in terms of the moral code, the virtues that were celebrated. And then finally, teaching Islam as something that can unite all of the tribes, directly challenging tribalism. we can see in those basic teachings now the radicalism of the Prophet Muhammad, which we wouldn't recognize without understanding the features of pre-Islamic Arabia.